Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Montana Libertarian Party meetup. We are pleased to welcome tonight one of the presidential candidates for the Libertarian Party, Mike ter Maat. And take it away, Mike. Tell us how you feel about the current state of America and how you plan to fix it.
Well, thank you. I'm not sure I can cram that into 90 seconds, so I might need a little bit of
There's no
flexibility.
time. There's no time limit at all.
All right, well, that's good. I should be done around Saturday afternoon at 3 then. That sounds about right. Listen, thanks for having me on. I've been looking forward to it, and I'm really grateful for your time. I think that we're probably all on the same page regarding the fact that we have a huge opportunity in 2024. And, I'm not trying to suggest I'm a political savant here, right? Everybody knows that we have a huge opportunity. And it's for a couple of different reasons. One is, of course, just objectively speaking, the candidates that the other parties are expected to put up, at least, the Republican Party nominee and the likely Democratic Party nominee, are just objectively unpopular, even within their own parties by historical standards, much less with the rest of the voting population of the United States. It's also true that our government has gone completely off the rails. Whether you're a fiscal conservative and therefore the Republican Party and you have gone in two different directions, or if you're a social liberal and you and your Democratic Party have gone in two different directions, almost no matter what type of voter you are, you recognize that the duopolistic political system in the United States is not serving your interests. The parties do not align with your values. The politicians who run these parties no longer even feign an interest in figuring out what it is that pushes your buttons. We have in the United States a growing sense of authoritarianism, and acceleratingly so. I think that we all learned this the hard way during the COVID regime, but I would argue that we see a growing sense of authoritarianism in every sense in which the government touches our lives. The simple dignity of being able to raise your children as you see fit is being eroded, taken away from you. The simple dignity of having a foreign policy that aligns with your values has been taken away from you. A currency that protects your ability to make ends meet and save for retirement, a mounting national debt, these things undermine your ability to live your life by your own standards, pursue the American dream as our parents' generation had, or more in line with what the youngsters are thinking about. They don't have the opportunity to pursue the American dream even as much as my generation has had in the last 25 years. And so these are deep, deep concerns. And I think the American public is waking up to the idea that many of the problems that we have in the United States, economically as well as socially, are the unfortunate result of bad public policy. Inflation doesn't just grow on a tree, right? These problems are the result of politicians making bad decisions. And I think that we have learned the hard way, and only after a great deal of time, that authoritarianism grows in a democracy for reasons that can play out even in the United States. We used to think it was impossible. I would say a generation ago, we used to make fun of other democracies when we saw authoritarian regimes take over. And it's certainly, shame on us. It's no laughing matter. It's no longer, a joke for others. It happens in the United States, and we understand why it happens. It happens when a politician leverages voters' fears to suggest, as a politician, I need greater power, right? I need greater latitude, because what you really have to fear is not the loss of your civil liberties. What you really have to fear is some other idiot coming to power. You really want me to remain in power. That's what it's all about. This is where authoritarianism grows. And we see with the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, both of those groups have absolutely given up on what used to be their political agenda. You no longer see a Democrat stand up with an anti-war agenda, standing up for your civil liberties. I would argue the Democratic Party is no longer, even in a true sense, socially liberal. The Republican Party makes almost no pretense at being fiscally conservative or trying to separate social policy from government public policy. These days, both parties have said out loud at last, their number one objective is to keep the other party out of office. That's what it has come down to. And that's what drives authoritarianism. And that's a big factor in why our government has gone off the rails. And I worry very much that our government will, by the middle of this century, absolutely collapse for one of several reasons. And it's not that I fear so much the loss of our federal government. I think, sadly, many of the people on this call tonight wouldn't even miss the federal government. We have so much given up on the idea that that organization can add value to anyone's lives. But what I worry about is the ensuing collapse of the US dollar, which is the only international reserve currency at the moment, a collapse of the national debt, and therefore a loss of tremendous amount of paper wealth, plunging the world into a deep recession from which it would be very difficult to climb out of any sooner than another generation or two. This is what I worry about. And having said that, I believe, yes, the Libertarian Party has an opportunity to do something about it, and therefore has an obligation. I think that if we're waiting for a Republican, for example, to lead the charge back toward a constitutional republic of the limited powers, I think you'd be waiting for something that's just not going to happen. I would say the same thing about Democratic politicians. If you're waiting for a Democratic politician to stand athwart history and say, stop doing the stupid things that our government is doing, that sounds lovely. I just don't think it's likely to happen. And for this reason, I think as libertarians, we need to be awake to the idea that we are the philosophical descendants of the people that wrote the Declaration of Independence, that put our Constitution together, that founded our government, and did so for only one real legitimate reason, and that is to protect our civil liberties. And so it is up to us. We are in a position where it's come hell or high water, it is going to be up to us to play a role. I think that we can disrupt the duopoly. I think we have an opportunity in 2024 to actually compete, to force the other parties to take into consideration our philosophy, our views, our voters. I think that the vast majority of Americans have a libertarian streak. They wouldn't call it that, right? Most Americans can't spell libertarianism. Most Americans aren't aware there's a Libertarian Party. And those who are aware that there's a Libertarian Party don't know what it means, don't know what it stands for. The value of the Libertarian Party brand is approximately zero. But most Americans have a libertarian streak in the sense that they do want to live their lives by their own standards and be left alone by their government. They do believe in fiscal conservatism and a separation of science from the government, church from the government, social policy from the government. These are basic libertarian values that have been undermined and disregarded by the political parties. And this represents not only our opportunity, but our obligation. I think that we can force the other parties to take us into consideration by running a very competitive campaign. But to do that, we have to do a couple things very, very differently than we have in the past. I would say two big things that we need to do very differently than we as a Libertarian Party have in the past. Number one, we have to run a completely differentiated message, a completely differentiated campaign platform. The object is not to find common ground with Democratic politicians or Republican politicians. To find common ground with their voters, sure, but not with their politicians. And I think that this was handled very, very incorrectly in the last, I would say, 3 cycles. You might remember going back to Gary Johnson, I'm fiscally conservative like Republicans and socially liberal like Democrats. That is a failure of marketing 101. defining yourself in the context of your competition, failing to give voters a reason to recognize you as a completely different choice, why are you even in the race? You undermine the very notion that there's a reason for being for the Libertarian Party when you define us as bits and pieces of something else. So I do believe that we need to run a platform that is very principles forward, that is uncompromisingly libertarian, unmistakably different, that we need to plant that flag in the ground and raise it high, and people will find it. And remember, we're not going after 50% of the vote, right? I don't know what percentage it would take to disrupt the duopoly. We've learned the hard way. It's necessarily north of the 3% that we got 2 cycles ago, but it's not 50%. Remember, in a 3-way race, 37% wins. That's a number that I think we need to allow to sink in. I recognize that mathematically it is conceivable that 33.4% could win. But as a practical matter, in a 3-way race, 37 will win. In a 4-way race, some smaller number could win, right? And so it is important for us to remember that we're not going after every voter. We're going after every voter that wants a different choice and is more obligated to their libertarian values than they are to one of the other parties. And so I think that the right strategy is to run a differentiated campaign. The right tactic, that's the right way to reach as many people as possible. It's the right way to disrupt the duopoly. And by the way, it's the right way to brand our party correctly for the sake of down ballot candidates, which is so important. Down ballot candidates in 2024, as well as future candidates, down ballot candidates and presidential candidates in the future. The fact that our party's brand is worth so little, I blame, at least in part, in large part, to past presidential campaigns, past national campaigns that have not correctly branded our party. Campaigns that have sought to water things down to reach out to as many people as possible. But I do believe that's the wrong strategy, no matter what your objective is. The second thing that we need to do differently than we have in past cycles is to run a very, very credible, very professional campaign. The team that I've put together already has 17 paid professionals. We don't pay them very much. But we have 17 people on our team already. We are not quite ready for the general election. It's February. We are ahead of schedule. We're far ahead of schedule by comparison to other campaigns and other campaigns in the past. And I believe that we will be ready for the general election come April. And of course, by June 1st, we will be rolling with a tremendous head of steam. Not only do you have to run a very professional campaign, but you have to run a very credible campaign. And I think that anyone who has paid any attention to our media, our social media, recognizes that we've worked very hard at protecting our credibility. We back up everything we say with detail, with realistic plans and programs. We lean very hard into my own personal background in public service and public policy. I was a professional economist for 25 years. I taught economics at 3 different universities. I worked for the White House as a couple of years as an economist. I had my own business, educating financial services executives and providing strategic consulting to financial institutions. I also spent almost a decade in Washington advocating for freer markets, greater competition in banking and in financial services and related businesses. So I've been around the block in terms of public policy. As a second career, I worked as a police officer for 11 and a half years from the age of 49 to 60 until just a couple of years ago. I was on the road for 11 and a half years in Broward County, Florida, all as a registered libertarian. It was a tremendous experience. It's the reason why now I spend so much time talking about the need to fundamentally reform the way that we manage police, both at the officer level and at the institutional level, at the agency level. There is so much that needs to change and that can change and change to make our communities stronger and healthier and more libertarian, more free. So there is a lot that we can do to preserve our credibility, to build our credibility. And I think that that's extremely important in this particular cycle. Number one, first and foremost, voters and donors and the media expect a certain threshold to be cleared in terms of professionalism and credibility, in competitiveness. They have to imagine that you could, at least theoretically, go all the way and compete to win, or else they're not going to pay any attention to you. Why should they pay any attention to you? The only reason anyone pays attention to anything in 2024 is that it's a competition. If you take yourself out of the competition, then, you know, there's really no reason for anyone to pay attention. After all, this is not a philosophy seminar. This is a competition, and you have to be in it to win it. The other reason I believe that preserving our credibility and leaning into my own public policy and public service background is so important is because we are running on such a differentiated platform. We're running on a platform that we call the Gold New Deal. You all can read about it at goldnewdeal.org. It's a collection of some of the most transformational ideas in libertarian thought. Because we're running such an edgy campaign, it's doubly important that we run with a lot of credibility. And let me explain why with an example. If you were running on a platform that said, for example, one of the planks was inflation is bad. I don't like inflation. I think we should have less inflation. I'm pretty sure you could hear that sort of thing out of the mouth of a Republican or a Democrat. And I don't think too many people would challenge you on that. I don't think that you need to have a background in economics. I don't think you have to have a background in public service or public policy. I don't think you have to have a background in anything to be able to say that. And people would, you know, they would nod their head with you. That's no big deal. On the other hand, if you're running on a platform that includes, as we are, a plank that says monetary policy in the United States has sucked for generations. It needs to change in a fundamental way, not just replacing the president of the United States. We need to change from the silly idea of running a discretionary monetary policy by locking up 18 people in a room every 6 weeks and asking what mood they're in. We need to run a rules-based system. We need to get rid of the Federal Reserve System for that and a number of other reasons. If that's your position, you better be able to back that up. And it is our position, and I can back it up. We do understand the Fed and how to get rid of it. And I think that that's important. Dr. Paul used to talk about ending the Fed all the time. And he didn't do it because it was easy to understand. He didn't do it because it was on the top of everyone's mind. He did it because it's important. And he did it because it's a differentiated message that illustrates ways in which our values and our attitude are different from those of the other parties. So that's how we see it. That's why I'm in the race. That's why we think that our campaign is on the right track. And I'd like your feedback on that. I'd like to know what you guys think are going to be some of the big issues, and I'd like to answer any questions you have.
Well, the thing you were saying earlier on, I tend to shoot off my mouth every chance I get. And I agree completely with the fact that you say everybody seems to agree with libertarian philosophy. You know, when I start talking to people, they say, yeah, you're right. The government is too big. The government is dishonest. It's the uniparty. They all believe the same thing. But then when you get to, well, I want to be a libertarian. Well, yeah, but you guys never win. It's good old, I hate to sound like the broken record of the Reckenwald, but I mean, he's right when he says, you know, we're not going to win. We win the 1% when we keep talking about the same thing. And I think he gets a little carried away with his rhetoric. I mean,
Jacob Hornberger says this.
yeah. Well, yeah. So does Hornberger. In fact, sort of almost everybody. I noticed in the Iowa caucuses, Chase came out ahead. You did admirably. You got 13%. Chase got 42%. So he kind of took away that. But I think Chase did well because he just looks good.
Don't read too much into the I appreciate you saying I did all right, but don't read too much into a retail caucus in the Libertarian Party. As you know, we don't even begin raising money and reaching out beyond the party until June 1st.
Right.
So, you know, a couple of hundred people paying attention in Iowa unfortunately doesn't really mean much.
No, it doesn't. And again, my first read on Chase Oliver is just he sells well. He's young, he's good looking, and he's fairly personable. But I don't buy a whole lot more of his policies than I do of yours. Or well, really, I right now, if I had to vote, I think I probably would lean more towards your policies. But right now, it's kind of a toss-up between all of you. Hornberger gets, or not Hornberger, Reckenwald gets a little carried away. He's awfully dogmatic. would be a good term.
That happens.
You know, he's an all or nothing kind of guy. I think he wants to tear everything down. And you know, the one big issue that all of you guys are getting on, and I agree with you completely, but as a 76-year-old man, tear down Social Security, kind of, that's a tough one. I agree that it's falling apart and it's a terrible, terrible system, but it's going to be hard. It's going to be really hard to fix that one.
Well, the idea is not to terminate it. Jacob Hornberger is the only one who says, when you end it, just terminate payments and screw the retirees. He's the only one who says that.
Yeah.
None of the rest of us have such a silly idea. The people who have already paid in have to get paid out
somehow. But
yeah. I mean, you can either offer them an exit ramp over time, or you can give them a lump sum check. But if you've paid in for 45 years, we need to kick you something back. We can't just say, thanks for the good times, have a nice life. That's not libertarian. That's evil. That's unethical.
Well, it overall always was a Ponzi scheme. And
well, of course it is. But if you've paid in for 45 years under the promise that you would be paid something back, we can't just all of a sudden say, well, now that you're 70 years old, we're not going to give you anything.
Yeah, I know.
That's unethical. That's not libertarian. That's unethical.
Yeah.
So I just want to make sure, Mike, you're saying that your campaign slogan will not be "screw the retirees."
No, it won't be.
Seems like the worst T-shirt idea ever. So sorry to interrupt.
It is the worst T-shirt idea ever. There are those who say that something I do say all the time is not a good idea, but unfortunately, I'm probably going to keep saying it. And that is that Social Security is evil.
Mm.
The idea that we would continue to recruit young people, and I use the word recruit broadly, force young people into a Ponzi scheme. The fact that it's a Ponzi scheme is the least of its problem. That's just a financial problem. The ethical problem, the greater problem, is that you're forcing people into a system. Number two, the ethical problem is that you're forcing people into a system that promises them a crappy rate of return, if any rate of return at all, right? The amount of money that you give up over the course of your lifetime by being forced into the Social Security system rather than being able to save on your own is in the hundreds of thousands of dollars per person. That's real money. That's an ethical problem. That's not just a math problem, right? How we unwind this is a math problem. But the idea that you would continue to force young people into it, that's an ethical problem.
The other trouble is, though, if you don't have some kind of situation like this, I don't see a terribly good education for the young people of today that will teach them to save. They're going to reach my age and they're going to be without money because they will have spent it all. You know, we don't.
Well,
we're not educating our children very well to save.
That is a problem. That's a huge problem. I don't necessarily view that as a problem for the federal government of the United States.
No, I agree.
But that is a huge problem. And of course, you know, this is the way the world worked until 1936. And this is the way that much of the rest of the world still works today. The fact that that stinks and that is a problem, and that, you know, we wish the world weren't that way, doesn't necessarily mean that it's up to the federal government of the United States to fix it. But having said that, it's very likely, right, that in the transition away from Social Security, there will be local authorities, state authorities, possibly even the federal government that offers education, maybe even in some circumstances requirements, which I wouldn't really appreciate, but it is nonetheless still likely that there will be requirements, at the very least, new options to get people into long-term savings accounts. Most people in the United States have a long-term tax-advantaged account today. But what you're talking about is, what do you do about a certain number of people who just won't do it? And I don't have a great answer for that, except that you're right, and that stinks.
How about we add to that, fix the educational system? There's another.
Well, of course we do, but for greater reasons than, you know, teaching people to save for their retirement. The primary and secondary education system in the United States stinks by international standards. It stinks by the standards of other businesses in the United States. It stinks in comparison to what it could be if we didn't have local monopolies controlling the public funds that have been collected for primary and secondary education, undermining competition both for the kids and the options that they might have, but undermining competition for the best teachers, and therefore allowing compensation for teachers to be artificially low, which of course lots of people like to complain about. But ironically, it is the teachers' unions that make the biggest contribution to suppressing long-term growth in the wage rate for teachers by suppressing competition and suppressing the ability of employers to discern the difference between a good teacher and a weak teacher, and undermining the ability of employers to dismiss weak teachers. All of these are factors in suppressing the growth of the wage rate.
Mike, could you put some specifics on the fiscal policy you want to promote?
We need to spend less money. Spending is theft. I know that we often say taxation is theft, which is true, right? But not only is taxation theft, long-term debt that we pass on to our kids is theft, inflation is theft. And it all comes from the fact that our government spends too much money. Were it up to me, I would pass a constitutional amendment that caps spending in proportion to our national income, in proportion to GDP. That is a difficult lift. En route to that, at the very least, we need to do a couple of things fundamentally. Number one, we need to stop spending so much money on defense. We can talk about that later. Number two, we need to change at a real fundamental level, at an institutional level, our welfare state. Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, the welfare block grants. We need to change the way that entitlements are structured in the United States. As a long-term objective, we need to get rid of them. These are what contribute to the vast majority of spending by the US federal government. The other thing that we need to do is to get out of the way of the economy and let it grow faster. I hesitate. You asked for specifics, so I'm going to give them to you. But I sometimes hesitate at mixing policy to allow the economy to grow faster with policy to cut back on government spending. And the reason I like to keep them separate is because so often, especially Republican politicians, but lots of mainstream politicians, Democrats and Republicans, lots of politicians like to sort of sidestep the need to cut back spending and say instead, well, under my policy, we would grow faster, and that's how we would get rid of the national debt, which is bullshit. You have to do all of it. You have to do, in my view, those three things in big chunks. One is cut back on defense spending, change entitlement programs, and number three, change our regulatory structure. And the way you get after number three is a couple of things. One is, as a libertarian-minded executive, if a libertarian were to take over the White House, a libertarian with a lowercase l, there are certain things that you can do. Much of the regulatory burden at the federal level, by executive order, you could make subject to the approval of governors in respective states, dumping it onto the laps of libertarian-minded, or at least economically growth-minded governors. Now, this might not, do too much in California, right, where they never met a regulation they didn't love. But it would mean something in Montana. It would mean something in Florida. It would mean something in Republican-controlled states to a certain extent, and certainly in any lowercase l libertarian-minded government-controlled state, where a governor could say, we are going to opt out, we are going to suppress, we are no longer going to be subject to this particular set of regulations. And so imagine a governor saying, we're going to position ourselves as the most business-friendly state in the union. We are going to compete for direct investment. Imagine if a governor, this is my favorite example, imagine if a governor were to say, we're going to opt out of federal regulation in nuclear energy production. Rather, we're going to make everything subject to a state program. And I'm going to say, we have put together a program. We have consolidated our regulations at the state level. We can promise you a permit to break ground in 18 months. You give us the answers you need, you get the financial bond. As libertarians, we believe that it should be nothing more than financial bonding and get going, right? But imagine if a governor were to say, you come up with the financial backing, including the bonding in case anything goes wrong, and we can issue you a permit in 18 months. Imagine how competitive that state would be. Because we know in the long run, nuclear energy has to be a part of America's future, not government subsidized green energy, right? We know this. But federal regulation gets in the way. There are other things that the executive can do at the federal level as well. You can, at least in part, dismantle certain elements unilaterally, dismantle certain elements of the swamp, of the regulatory structure. You can reassign personnel. You can dismiss a certain number of personnel. You can fail to hire a certain number of personnel. You can restructure certain agencies. The FBI is an interesting example, not of a regulatory agency, but an agency that would not be all that difficult to get rid of, maybe not legally, but as a practical matter. And I think that most Americans would be surprised how comfortably they could live without the FBI. Just by restructuring it, just by detailing out its personnel to other agencies and to state agencies, you can effectively make the FBI stand down. And that model can play out in other agencies as well. In other words, there are things that you can do to get the government out of the way of businesses in the United States. So there are things that we can do. Some of them at a fairly detailed level, and some of them have to be accomplished at the 30,000-foot level. Regarding defense, for example, it is true that you cannot unilaterally unwind every single foreign base. But a large number of bases you can immediately and unilaterally unwind and bring the troops home. In another set, it does require a treaty adjustment. In another set, it's just a matter of waiting for a contract to run out. But you can get after it fairly quickly. And there are ways to pressure the Senate into going along with the treaty adjustments that you need to make. You know, you put a list of domestic bases in front of a senator, and you put a list of foreign bases in front of a senator. And you say, if you don't pick something from list B, I'm going to start picking stuff from list A. And I think we would all be pleasantly surprised how quickly the Senate wants to play ball. What do you all think will be hot topics and big issues this fall? I ask because it seems like almost every cycle we feel like foreign policy is going to rise to the top, foreign policy is going to dominate. And yet, almost invariably, the domestic economy rises up and takes over and captures the imagination of voters and the media.
Well, if you've watched the price of gas coming down, I think the economy is going to get better. Just because I think it's going to get better. I've got some stocks that I'm planning to hold until about June and then bailing out real quick at that point. Just because I think it's such a political football, that's what he's going to do. They're going to manipulate the economy like they always do. So I think the economy is going to become less of an issue just because they're going to manipulate it.
Do you think it'll play into Joe Biden's favor that the economy remains fairly intact?
Oh, people don't pay that much attention. And yes, the masses don't seem to be paying much attention. I think the economy will. My guess. I think the economy will become less of an issue. I don't see how. I don't see how Joe Biden can possibly get reelected because he's such an idiot. But
if you're confident, well, they're all idiots, and one of them is going to get elected unless it's me. And I'm not suggesting that I'm the only one who's not an idiot, but one of us four idiots is likely to win. If you don't think that Joe Biden is going to win, right? And I don't know. I don't see mispredicted every election. If Joe Biden's not going to win, then maybe you should hang on to those stocks.
Well, I just figured, I figure the stock market is such a bubble anyway that at this point I'm about ready to bail out of everything and get a bunch of gold and hide away here in Montana. You can see in the background, you can see where I live. That is my driveway. Yeah, not quite right, not right now. I took a picture this morning and it's all white, but I didn't get a chance to put it up there. No, I'm stuck away here in Montana, and I'm leaving the rest of the world alone. I'm gonna.
And I hope it leaves you alone as well.
I hope so too. I'm gonna buy a bunch of gold and just hide away. No, I think the whole world is getting manipulated by a bunch of idiots. And they're not idiots because that's why they get away with manipulating it. I still kind of in the back of my mind, well, I was gonna put $100 down on a 300-to-1 bet on Michelle Obama. Because I mean, who have the Democrats got to pull out of the whip? They don't want to run Biden. A bunch of them don't want to run Biden. They're talking about pulling out Newsom, but God, do we really want to turn the United States into California? But he is a slick son of a bitch. But who else have they got to run? And they're devious, slimy bastards. Pardon my French. They're not a slimier group than the Democrats right now. I mean, say what you will. In my old age, it just galls me to have to say something like Donald Trump is probably the best president we've had in my lifetime. And he is terrible, terrible. But look at what we've had to pick from. I mean, that basically is what got me into the Libertarian Party. In 2016, I woke up and said, good God, you voted for the letter at the end of the name for 50 years. I never paid much attention. I was one of those terrible people. I hate to admit it out loud, but I voted for the R, mainly because my father was a Goldwater Democrat, or Republican rather. And I woke up and I said, you know, I gotta do something. I got a 35-year-old daughter. I would like to make the world a little better for her. I gotta get involved. I cannot be a Democrat under any circumstances, and the Republicans are no better. Gee, this Libertarian Party kind of they have my best interests at heart. They agree with what I say. So here I am. You know, and anyway, that's where I am. And
well, I appreciate
I
appreciate that. Louis, welcome to the chat. We were just talking about what we think are the hot topics likely to rise up in the fall. I'm interested in feedback from you all, and Matt and Tony and Scott. To the extent to which you have thoughts on this, I would love to hear it. Or if there are particular questions that I can answer for you, I'd like the chance to do so. Hey, Matt.
I got I don't know, just looking at Robert Kennedy Jr.'s campaign, he seems to be focusing a lot on medical freedom. And it seems like his message is kind of resonating with a lot of people. I just maybe it is something that's going to become a hot topic.
You may be right. My guess is, and this is an empirical matter, we'll just see how it plays out. My guess is that he's picking up a lot of support just as a protest to the existing, particularly the existing Democratic incumbent president of the United States, as well as to a certain extent a protest against the duopoly itself. I think that that's probably where a lot of his support is coming from, and good for him for jumping into it with a strong brand like the Kennedy family name and doing so relatively early to build up some steam in advance. You're right, he is strong on medical freedom. I'm a little leery. I don't view Robert Kennedy Jr. as a libertarian. And let me speak to a couple reasons why. Regarding medical freedom, he is certainly strong in medical freedom. And by the way, we have a physician on our team who is very strong in this area as well. Irene Mavrikakis has done a lot of research into vaccine injuries, a lot of research into how vaccines are developed. She has a little bit of a side practice in treating vaccine injured individuals. So she is truly one of our nation's leading experts in this field. But having said that, while Kennedy is good in this area, I worry that part of the reason he's good is because he doesn't like the vaccines, right? Well, that's fine. Neither do most of us like the vaccines, right? But I get the impression, and I'm going to serve on a panel with him in a couple of weeks, and so I plan on asking him the following question. If there were a perfect vaccine, imagine as a thought experiment, and you already see where I'm going with this. If the vaccine were perfect, if you take it, you're going to live. If you don't take it, you're going to die. 100% certainty, 100% efficacy. It shuts down transmissibility 100%. There's no side effects. It's been tested long term. No unforeseen consequences. All right, it's a definitionally perfect vaccine. This is a thought experiment. Would the government have the right to tell you that you must take it? For a libertarian, the answer has got to be no, right?
Yeah.
So in that sense, I'm always leery when I hear someone argue against vaccine mandates based on the science, because it leads me to believe, well, what if the science were terrific? You'd be okay with the vaccine mandates? For me, it doesn't matter how good the vaccine is. And this is part of the reason why I argue that we shouldn't be asking each other who got vaccinated and who didn't. It's got nothing to do with it, right? The problem is the government told us we had to, under penalty of losing your job in many cases. The government put out propaganda, which it shouldn't have been doing even if it were true, but it turns out that much of the propaganda was not true. Turned out the government was hiding facts that it knew about. Turned out it was hiding access to facts that it didn't know about. Turns out that it failed to highlight the fact that pharmaceutical companies are protected from liability, which is pursuant to existing federal law, which is a bad idea, which should be disclosed to people when they make their decision about whether to take the vaccine or not. It was suppressed, the information regarding how the vaccine was developed, how the disease was developed, how it leaked from the Wuhan lab, who paid for it, the fact that Anthony Fauci was receiving remuneration, and other physicians, I don't mean to single him out, he's just the most famous one, but other members of the administration were getting kickbacks, apparently legally. That doesn't make it any better. Legally, for participating in the approval of the vaccines. All these things should have been disclosed, not a message that says, get vaccinated or you're a jerk, right? Or worse, get vaccinated or you're going to lose your job. All of these things are true, but that doesn't mean that if the vaccine were perfect, even if the entire system were perfect, that doesn't mean that the government has a right to tell you have to take the vaccine. And so I think there's a difference there between a Kennedy approach and a libertarian approach. And I see this play out in other areas where we have common ground with him as well. For example, he is very strong on disentangling corporate control from government control, right? He recognizes the problem that is crony capitalism, the problem of people going back and forth between corporate boardrooms and government policy making, and corporations doing government bidding and vice versa. He's strong on all of that. He wants it disentangled. Good for him. That's what we want too. But I get the impression, once again, that the reason he wants this is not for the same reason that we want this, which is to say corporations need to be left the hell alone so they can work efficiently so that markets can be competitive, so they can make decisions that are in the interest of the economy. Rather, Kennedy wants the government to have a free hand to knuckle under corporations in a more effectively regulated environment. He's a good government guy at heart. He's a big government guy, but he wants government to work better, whereas we want it to work less because we know that that's how it does work better. So that's just a couple of examples. As another example, which was not apparent at first when he announced, but has become uber apparent, we have common ground with Kennedy when it comes to not wanting to fund other nations through block grants, right? Selling arms, subsidizing whatever it is that they're doing. We have common ground with him on this. But it did seem to me early on, is this because he really doesn't believe in foreign aid, which is our position? Or is it that he just doesn't like the particulars of the situations he has seen so far? And it turns out to be the latter, because he's all about a blank check to Israel. He's all about backing up Israel, funding Israel, providing arms, providing intelligence, providing political cover, providing military cover against would-be entrants to the war to protect Israel. And so it turns out that he's not just blanket against military foreign intervention. He's just against it when he doesn't like the situation. That's not a libertarian attitude. That's just, you know, a slightly more discerning attitude toward making government work better, but remaining the same size. That's not what we call libertarianism. Situational libertarianism, huh?
I'd agree with that. Just as kind of, how would a libertarian president go about actually disentangling us from the foreign affairs? And would that also require a lot of work with Congress?
To get to where we want to go eventually would require a lot of work from Congress, especially the Senate, but there's a lot of things that you can do unilaterally too. The first week has to include a lot of phone calls to heads of state in, for example, Europe, that says the United States is going to be exiting NATO. This is your 12-month, 18-month heads up. To the extent to which you believe that it's in your interest or you're in your nation's interest to remain fearful of the Russian army, I would call it paranoid. But to the extent to which you remain in a defensive posture because you're worried about the Russian army, notwithstanding what we've learned over the past year, that the Russian army is utterly incapable of overrunning even Ukraine. Notwithstanding all that, if you want to remain fearful of Russia, you do you. This is your heads up. You start spending 3, 3.5, or 4% of your GDP on defense. But the United States is no longer going to be your plan A. Whatever had been your plan B, it's now your plan A, because we're going to be out of the business of supporting your economy. Similarly, we need to be sending a signal in the China Sea that our attitude toward Taiwan is going to be different. I believe that there is no such thing as a relationship on this planet that is made better by a strategy of ambiguity. Try that with your spouse. Strategic ambiguity is dopey. Foreign policy success comes from understanding clearly in your own head what's in your interest and conveying that to people that need to hear it. It is not in our long-term national interest to support, to back up, come hell or high water, another nation we seem to have gotten ourselves into what a lot of people would like to believe is a self-fulfilling prophecy of having to back up Taiwan because we've accidentally sent the signal that says that we would back up Taiwan in a military conflict. And therefore, we have invited in a tremendous amount of direct investment, especially in technology, especially in chips, especially in the high-end chips that we believe that we need access to for the development of the artificial intelligence economy coming up. And so now we believe that we have to back up Taiwan because it's such an important piece of our supply chain. And we need to begin to unwind that. We need to send the signal that says, if you invested in Taiwan, or if you're considering investing in Taiwan going forward, because you need to invest in a place that's backed up by the United States Department of Defense. Can I interest you in Billings, Montana? Can I interest you in Milwaukee? Can I interest you in Ocala, Florida? These are places that we will back up. But in the long run, Taiwan's not going to be one of them. And at the same time, you need to send that signal to the People's Republic of China that says, basically, at the moment, Taiwan is an important piece of our supply chain, and we expect that to change over the next several years. Remember that China plays a long game, whereas we play a short game.
Yeah.
The Chinese government wants to bring Taiwan into the fold. They don't necessarily need to do that by October, right? Nor any particular October. But they do need to do it eventually. They are not seeking a war with the United States. I'm not certain they would shrink from it, but they're not seeking it. Their objective is not war per se. Their objective is to bring Taiwan back. They can have their cake and eat it too. And so can we. But we need to play our cards right and send the signal that things are going to be changing over the next decade. By the way, I believe that we need to change our policy toward Ukraine and toward Israel as well. And Israel is the one that really bothers me because it feels so personal, right? Many of us have deep connected tissue with Israel for any number of reasons. Now, I've got people on my team with family there. I've traveled Israel extensively. I've traveled Palestinian territory. I've sent my son to train in Jordan. I've sent my daughter to attend bat mitzvah in Israel. I've traveled with my family throughout the Middle East, the UAE, Morocco, Egypt. It feels personal, right? And look, for reasons of faith, many Americans feel a connectedness to Israel, which I think we can all appreciate. And not just Israel. A prominent member of the Libertarian Party announced a few months ago that he had lost a cousin in Palestine to the war. It does feel personal. It's, you know, thousands of miles away, and yet we feel very, very close to what's going on there. But having said that, that doesn't mean that they need to own our foreign policy and that we need to own their foreign policy. They deserve an opportunity to run a foreign policy that's in their interest rather than having the White House breathing down their neck every 5 minutes. They deserve an opportunity to pursue what they think is in their interest. And I don't think it's an ethical matter for us to be imposing on families all across the United States, many of whom are among the least able to afford it, to extract money from them and send it to Israel or to anybody else, to send to the Ukraine, to fight in someone else's war. And a lot of us feel connectedness to Ukraine as well. But this doesn't necessarily mean that we should be involved in another conflict. I do worry that we will eventually, if we don't correct course fundamentally and soon, that we will eventually run into a military conflict from which we cannot extract ourselves as easily as we have been in the past. That eventually we'll run into, look, if for no other reason than just taking 100 random shots, right? Eventually, you're going to get yourself into a situation that's difficult from which to extract. And I worry that at some point over the next couple of decades, we will end up in a world war. By world, I define that as the United States, the United Kingdom, and a couple of other nations on one side, and one or two of or three of Iran or China or Russia on the other side, multiple theaters, and the risk of a nuclear exchange in the long run. I worry that if we don't course correct, just statistically speaking, it's likely to bump into a situation that really provides a different type of threat than we have faced up until now. Louis, on that
Thanks.
depressing note, was I getting toward an answer to your question?
Yeah, somewhat. I just always kind of wonder about the logistics if we were able to actually get someone in there, if it is even logistically feasible to actually withdraw our bases, to withdraw from NATO, a big one, and how much that would be blocked by other parts of the government that might not necessarily agree. And I jumped in a little late, but I was just kind of wondering, Mike, and I've listened to you a little bit. What kind of differentiates you from other people that are running for LP?
The combination of a differentiated platform, a commitment to a differentiated platform. You know that we're running in what we call the Gold New Deal, and a commitment to running a very professional, a very principled forward campaign, but a very credible campaign that leans into my personal background in public service and public policy. As you may know, I'm the only candidate in this race with any public service background, much less 35 years worth. Inside the Libertarian Party, as you know, I'm preaching to the choir here. Inside the Libertarian Party, experience in public service and public policy doesn't carry a tremendous amount of water. And for reasons that I think we all appreciate, right? There's plenty of times when it doesn't carry a lot of water with me. But outside of the Libertarian Party, it is of significant importance. It's a major contributing factor to clearing the threshold of which I was speaking earlier in the minds of donors, voters, the media, in terms of your ability to actually compete to disrupt the duopolistic political system that we have in place.
Fair enough.
Tony and Scott, are there particular issues that you think? I see that I've run over what I believe was my initially allotted hour, but I appreciate you all hanging in there with me. Tony and Scott, are there particular issues that you think will rise up that you worry about, or anything about which I could answer a question?
There is no time limit at all.
All the better.
Sure. So one of my concerns with, I really don't pay too much attention to the national LP scene just because, to me, it doesn't seem like it really affects me in any sort of meaningful way, especially for our local elections. So I guess that's always my question is like, what do you see your role is in terms of helping or supporting the downstream elections throughout the years?
There is one answer for 2024, and then there's another answer for after 2024. I ran locally a couple of years ago. I ran for Congress, and what I learned the hard way is truly the value of the Libertarian Party brand is around zero. There are those who would argue that the value of the Libertarian Party brand is negative. That in many elections, you can get more votes running as an independent than you could as a libertarian. That's a depressing thought. I believe that that is in no small part the fault of past presidential campaigns. My job is to correctly brand the Libertarian Party and to do so in a way that is memorable. To change, in a long-term sense, change the perception of the party. So that when you're out there, or when I'm out there running for local office, you don't have to spend the first 50% of every conversation explaining what libertarianism is or what the Libertarian Party is all about. We need to establish in the minds of American voters that there is a Libertarian Party and what it's all about. That's what 2024 is set up to do. And that's what my objective is in 2024. As I said, for the sake of down ballot candidates, as well as for the sake of future Libertarian presidential candidates. That's very, very important. After 2024, yes, I will, in stark contrast to past campaigns, I'm not going to name names here, but I will remain involved because I am sensitive to what it takes to run for local office, having done so myself in the past. Many of my teammates have done so as well. Wendy Szabo, who's on this, ran a robust local campaign last year, which was very, very exciting. But as she would tell you as well, you spend a lot of your time explaining what libertarianism is and what the Libertarian Party is all about. We need to make that much more efficient. So there's a lot that our campaign will continue to be able to do in terms of branding, but also in terms of communication, in terms of data sharing, particularly when it comes to donors, as well as media. So staying involved is very, very important to me personally.
Awesome. Good to hear. Thanks.
By the way, there are things that we can do, and I don't want to go too far down this path because we need to run a very credible national campaign. But there are certain things that we can do to bias our campaign towards certain states where we can make a real difference in terms of ballot access. Where there's a state where, you know, you need twice the vote total that we have any chance of getting, maybe never mind. In a state where we're going to make that vote total, even if we fall on our face, never mind. But most states, I should say many states, you can make a difference in terms of future ballot access by making sure that you clear the particular statutorily required threshold. So we need to pay attention to that as well.
Is it okay if I talk about this a little bit, Mike?
Please, David Moskowitz.
Okay. So thank you for using my last name and saying it correctly. It's very difficult for people to do.
I'm very proud of my ability to pronounce your last name.
Yes, me too. It's like in Scotland and Puerto Rico. That's the only two places they know how to pronounce it. So, so as somebody who has reformed a county affiliate down here in Florida, we are actually holding candidates, local candidates for office based on who's going to be the presidential candidate, because we don't want to put candidates out there who are going to have to apologize for who the national candidate is. And that's how important it is, because like going back, whether you're wherever you stood on him, you know, whatever. So like going back to like Barack Obama in 2008, right? The reason so many Democrats won was because he was such an inspiring candidate who could speak to the issues of what people were facing. And whether or not you agreed with what he was saying, he knew how to speak to those issues. And so that's why, you know, in Hillsborough County, we're in the Tampa Bay area down here in Florida. we've decided we're waiting to see who the nominee is going to be before we go through the effort of putting somebody on the ballot, because it needs to be a presidential candidate that can speak to the issues of people, of everyday people. And if we have to send a candidate out there to apologize for what the presidential candidate is saying, then it's just a huge negative, and it's setting us back. And so that's why, if nothing else, like, even if, say, I am one of the few people, I believe, that thinks this is 100% wrong. Mike and I have had conversations about this. I 100% believe a libertarian has a pathway to the presidency this time around in 2024. But if the libertarian nominee did not have that pathway, that person is still the person who is representing all of the down ballot candidates. And whether or not they have to apologize for being a libertarian, or whether or not they can be proud for how they're being represented on the national level, because that's who's going to get the most attention, and that's the message that's going to get out there. And so we can be ideological, like, purists, and refer to, you know, like Ludwig von Mises, I'm not saying it correctly, Mises, you know, like all of these like philosophers, or we can say, this is the issue you're facing, this is how we're going to deal with it. And because I'm a local candidate, I can point to this person. And so that's one of the reasons why Mike and I get along, is because I feel like he's one of those people who can say, this is what you're facing, this is how we're going to deal with it now. We're not going to go to the radical extent. We're going to move the needle forward to where it needs to be, because we know that's realistically what it's going to be, because there's also Congress, you know, there's all of these levels. And so it's very important to nominate a candidate who can be seen legitimately by disenfranchised, you know, the 50% of disenfranchised Democrats and the 50% of disenfranchised Republicans, because that's a huge voter block. And so now I'm going to shut up, because this is my whole platform, and this is my argument that I make every single meeting that we have with libertarians, is it really makes a difference who we nominate, and that they're a good presidential candidate.
It is true that the campaign matters. Thanks for all that. You say that all the time. I'll have to go to one of those meetings where you do. It does matter, and I would say our campaign is committed to the idea that you run a radical platform, that you state what the North Star is, but you back that up with enough credible detail and plans and recognition of the political difficulties and realities, so that you build a trust with people, both in terms of credibility and in terms of where you're going. I think that people need to know where you're going. And I think that that's important, not only because that helps them trust that you are sort of simpatico with their attitude, even if it's difficult to get there, but I think it's also important just from an honesty perspective. You know, we picked out Social Security as an example that we were talking about earlier. I feel in some sense I would be not completely honest. Like, there would be an ethical problem there if I were to say to people, our long-term goal is to adjust Social Security so that it can keep going, right? We need to adjust the retirement age. Or that our long-term objective, slightly more radical, might be, you know, we want a government-sponsored savings account so that you have an option to opt out of Social Security, but we want to keep Social Security going in parallel. That would definitely be an improvement over where we are today, but that's not where we're going in the long run either. I think people need to know where we're going and how we plan to get there, recognizing that some of these are long-term projects. So even though, you know, Louis brought up an important point, that there are challenging logistics in terms of closing out bases or obligations, and those are two different things. In some cases, the bases are easier to close, and in certain cases, obligations are easier to terminate. In other cases, bases are very hard to close. And with NATO, for example, our commitment is by treaty. So these things are challenging to accomplish in our long-term projects. But that's one of the reasons why you need to tell people where you're going. You need to tell people this is where we want to be.
I wanted to add or ask something real quick about that too. Just, you know, I don't feel like libertarians as a whole are really that far away from each other on a lot of these issues. You know, we can agree on a huge amount of these things we're talking about. Maybe there's slight differences in how things are going to be carried out. Should we have, you know, someone elected to the executive branch? But in reality, you know, candidates have been elected recently. You look at Trump. You know, what was a couple of things that he kept saying over and over again? He wanted to drain the swamp. Well, that's really a philosophical viewpoint. You know, he wanted to. He claimed he wanted to put Hillary Clinton in jail, which everyone, you know, should have known that was BS to begin with. We in Latin America, they've had a self-identified libertarian just become elected. You know, he showed up to campaigns or to rallies with a chainsaw. You know, these aren't really very deep philosophical, you know, ways to get elected, but these people became hugely popular with these sorts of slogans and you know, whatever, you know, showmanship that they were doing. How do you feel about that as far as Americans in general? What's going to resonate with them?
I think that what is going to resonate is a recognition that you're sick of it, I'm sick of it, we're sick of it, and we represent something completely different. America is not a nation of chainsaw-toting politicians, which is too bad because, you know, I've gone through a dozen chainsaws in my time and have a busted old one in the garage as well as two that work, but a busted old one I would love to travel with. I just don't think that it would play as well in Peoria as it played in Buenos Aires. And that's too bad because Javier Milei is an Austrian trained economist like I am. And, you know, I've got every respect for what he has accomplished. By the way, parenthetically, to your point, this argues more your point than my point. We do a lot of videos. I do a lot of videos. The video that I did that got the most traction, as a matter of fact, as much traction as all the others added up, was emulating Milei at the whiteboard, taking off the names of agencies and throwing them away. And he would say, afuera, which is Spanish with his Argentine accent, for out, right? And he would throw them on the ground. Okay. We got at least 1.5 million views for that we know of. Wow. Now, on the one hand, I should probably have my feelings hurt that no one watched any of my videos to that extent when I was just an American economist, right? But you go to a whiteboard and you start tossing shit on the ground, all of a sudden people are eating it alive. To your point, right? To your point. I do believe that what resonates with people is the right attitude. And I think that people are absolutely sick of the direction in which our government has been going. And I think that that will catch on. At least in the beginning, we need to be slightly showmanship careful because we need to preserve our credibility. But we will be coming out in the summer, and I don't mean the fall. We will be coming out in the summer delivering advertising that is expensive with borrowed money to get the ball rolling. This is in stark contrast to the way libertarian presidential campaigns have been run in the past, with extremely forward messaging based on our principles, cleaving a hard edge against Republicans and a hard edge against Democrats. People will know relatively quickly in this cycle that there's a new sheriff in town, that we have a very different message, we have a different brand, and most importantly, we represent a completely differentiated set of policy prescriptions.
That's interesting. And I was just kind of thinking about it. I mean, Barack Obama did, I feel like in the United States, we elect personalities. We may like their policy prescriptions. However, for a guess, I mean, most people that voted for Barack Obama or Donald Trump elected their personality. They may like Drain the Swamp, but they like a guy that stands up there and says, no, no, you know. So I would kind of view it more like that. Definitely. I do think it's an interesting strategy to wait to see who the presidential candidate is going to run, for who your local area is going to run in conjunction with them. In Montana, I don't think we have that luxury because there's just not enough of us in the party. But it's an interesting strategy, and I kind of like the thought of that. Just my 2 cents.
Me too. I get that. And I hear what you're saying about Trump and about and about Milei and about Barack Obama. And look, there's no arguing the fact that Barack Obama is possibly, let me think this through. I've not said this out loud, so I may be saying something I can't back up. Barack Obama is quite possibly the most recognizably cool individual on the planet, right? I mean, is there someone else in this world that could walk into a room and capture it the way Barack Obama can? You know, we used to say that about Michael Jordan, right? I believe that Michael Jordan's coolness may be possibly surpassed by Barack Obama. Not so with Joe Biden, right? Here's a guy who did very little campaigning, has got very little of anything. I don't even care how you end that sentence. Charm, charisma, personality, oomph, cognizance. There's not a lot going on there, and yet he won anyway. And maybe that's a contrast between credibility and Donald Trump is the correct analysis there. So we do need to differentiate, and differentiate hard. Robert Kennedy Jr. doesn't have a lot of personality. He's a nice guy. He's a smart guy. I don't mean to crap all over him. You know, he seems like a good guy. He does. I think he's honestly, you know, an American patriot who wants best for the United States. I just think his ideas are dopey. And I look forward to, you know, serving on the panel with him in a couple of weeks and possibly getting to know him a tiny little bit. But, you know, to your point, Louis, I personally believe that the reason the Gary Johnson campaign imploded in 2016 after he said, "What's Aleppo?" was not just because he forgot what Aleppo was, right? It's because he had not given people enough of a reason to hang on to him. And I offer as a contrast, to your point, I offer as a contrast Donald Trump, who famously said, they say I could go out on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone without losing a lot of support. And don't mishear me. I'm no Donald Trump fan. I was in New York in the 80s. I got a long history of reasons to dislike this guy, right? But I'm not sure he was wrong. People know why they love Donald Trump. They know why they hate Donald Trump. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say shooting someone on Fifth Avenue is worse than forgetting the name of a town in Syria. I'm just going to assert that, okay? But I'm not sure that he was wrong. He says things that are dumber than "What's Aleppo" weekly, right? And yet his base hangs in there with him. Not so with Gary Johnson. When the drumbeat came for Gary, he did not have the base to hang on. He just had not given people enough of a reason to hang on to him. And we will not make that mistake. People will know why they don't like our campaign. People will know why they do like our campaign. And if there's anything that I can promise you, it is that I will make a mistake. I don't know what it will be. I will not shoot someone on Fifth Avenue. I will not forget what Aleppo is. But it will be something else. Undoubtedly, there will be something else that comes up, right? And it will be painful. I don't know what it is. I will try to avoid it. But when it does, I hope not to lose a lot of support because people will know what's really important.
Well, it looks like we're down to the last 6 people. Anyone else have any
We've
other-
outlasted them, Dave.
Well, I came in late, so I figured I'd stay late, make up.
Well, I appreciate that, and thank you for your participation, answering, asking questions.
No, I appreciate it definitely, Mike.
Anyone else with one more question before we sign off, or one more comment? Does anyone have a vote as to what'll be the most important issue that we should be prepared for, or the most differentiating factor?
War. I think that standing as the true anti-war party, and I've voted Republican, I've voted Democrat most definitely, especially when I was a lot younger, but I was always fairly staunchly anti-war. And I just see that as something that's coming down the pipe more and more.
I hear you from your lips to God's ears. It's a huge point of differentiation, and that cuts in our favor. Do you believe, let me ask you, let me see if I can dump this turd on your lap instead of mine. I believe that America is ready for a full-throated anti-war message. Am I delusional, or do you think, because I get the sense from you that you agree with me that it's a big point of differentiation. However, having said that, do you think America will bite, or do you fear that I'm wrong? And although it will be a point of differentiation, it won't be something that America is ready for.
I would like to think that you are right. I would like to think so. I am afraid that because I think for America to have another large anti-war movement, that we almost have to be seeing casualties at that time. And not, we've had 3 soldiers die the other day. It might have to be something like Vietnam for another large anti-war movement to actually gain traction. I'd like to think that you're right. But I'm in Montana. I live around a lot of Republicans. I have very staunch Democrats in my family.
Me too.
And depending on which war you're talking about, they're very pro one or the other.
Hey, these days the Democrats are pro-war. And
yeah.
I would like to point out the fact that if you look at the wars that we've been in, and if you look at the fact that we're not supposed to go to war until Congress declares war. And
correct.
Look at the number of wars we have been in since we have not declared war since 1942. And I would also like to point out the fact of all the wars we've been in, because I've been dodging war since Vietnam. I'm a Vietnam dodger. And because I was 18 during Vietnam. And all of the wars that we have been in, Vietnam, Korea, all of them, and I got a list of them if you want to look at it, we have not won any of them. We have not won a single war. Afghanistan, we didn't win. Vietnam, we didn't win. Korea, we didn't win. We keep going to these wars and we haven't won one yet. So why do we keep doing it?
Oh,
Dave, you
those
turned
weren't lowers.
18 in 1965?
What?
You
Yeah.
turned 18 in 1965?
Yep. I turned
Man, you look
21
good.
I turned 21 in 69. So yeah, I'm that old. I'm 76. So, yep. I learned a little trick. If you light a bunch of matches heads on take the old-fashioned stick matches and you light a bunch and inhale the fumes, you can wheeze for about 4 hours. That, and now I have
Good to know, buddy.
now I have COPD, which I'm not sure wasn't part of the problem. But anyway.
But you get to breathe all of that fresh air from your
Yeah.
driveway that you have behind you that you said, you know.
Yeah. Well, but I grew up in Southern California when I had a view that looked like this over to the San Bernardino Mountains from Riverside, and it would look like this in the morning, and by noon it would be you couldn't see the mountains. So anyway,
Well, to your point, Dave, I do think that there are two different ways to go at this. One is an ethical matter, right? Reminding Americans that their ethics, their values don't line up with the foreign policy that purports to represent them. Most Americans would not choose to have entered into these wars just based on how we feel about matters of life and death and how we feel about allowing other nations to chart their own political futures. But there is another way to look at it. If this will be a weird thing to say, if you set ethics aside, which is, I recognize, impossible for libertarians, set ethics aside for a moment and just consider it objectively, just empirically. As you said, the United States, our Defense Department is very good at a tactical level, right?
oh yeah,
We're good at death and destruction, moving material, opening sea lanes, taking ground, holding ground. We're good at everything tactical. We are not good strategically. We do not achieve long-term strategic goals that are recognizably in the interest of the American people.
we don't have
There
any.
are not examples out there to which the American public would point and say, notwithstanding the billions of dollars we blew or the thousands of lives that we lost, it was a good idea anyway. There really aren't those examples out there. And when you consider Afghanistan and Iraq, you're not talking about billions of dollars. You're talking about trillions.
Yeah.
And sadly, you're not talking about thousands of lives lost. You're talking about millions. And so I wonder whether America needs to be reminded that wherever your ethics may be and whatever it is that you tell yourself about patriotism and rallying around our flag and our elected leaders, so-called leaders, our politicians, rallying around the executive authority. The truth of the matter is that empirically speaking, objectives are not being achieved in our interest. Our lives are objectively worse off because of these military interventions.
Well, you talk about the strategic goals. What are they? What was the point of Afghanistan? What if we had won, whatever the win means? What would we have won?
We have been told ever since Ronald Reagan, well, we've been told since before Ronald Reagan, that we could achieve peace through strength and that required the projection of military hegemony. And the truth is that military hegemony does not lead to strength,
No.
and strength does not lead to peace.
Right.
If there is one lesson that we should have learned over the past 100 years, it is that peace is not achieved through strength, but rather strength is achieved through peace.
Right. And the other thing we keep hearing little by little, although not on the mainstream media, is that right now, because of these wars we keep fighting, we are probably at one of our weakest levels. We keep sending all of our arms over to Afghanistan or over to Ukraine,
Ukraine.
and we're at one of our lowest levels. Our munitions are at the lowest level. So we're not particularly strong right now. Which, oh well.
Right. It undermines our stated objective of being able to fight 2 world wars at the same time in different theaters and win them both,
Yeah.
which I think may be setting the bar a little high. But
yeah.
Jeff Miller of Texas, did you have, it looks like you have a hand up, if I'm interpreting that correctly. Did you have a comment before we close out here tonight?
Yes, I'm waiting patiently, teacher, for my opportunity. So first I wanted to agree with what David said earlier about campaigning. The average voter doesn't want to hear philosophy or Austrian economists or anything like that. Their eyes glaze over. They want to hear about how you're going to help them in their everyday issues. So in my state representative campaign, both last time and this time, I tend to ask people, well, what is it you want to do in your life right now that you can't do? And then when they tell me, then I tell them the ways that government is preventing them from doing what they want to do. And if you want to change that, then vote Miller or vote Libertarian. So that's I try to take those opportunities and sometimes just listen to somebody complain about, what's going on, and then take that opportunity to take, just say that same thing about this is the way to change it. As far as a question, I want to ask you this because I haven't heard anybody ask you this. I'm sure probably out there on the trail somebody has, but in any of these organized things, I haven't. As probably most people in here know, the Libertarian Party doesn't select the candidates the same way the other parties do, including the vice presidential choice, where the other parties, they announce a running mate way before the convention, and everybody just rubber stamps it. And obviously, in the Libertarian Party, we've got that independent streak where often the delegates won't necessarily select the same person that a presidential candidate has picked. But I'm curious what your plans are in that area. Do you have somebody in mind as a vice presidential choice? And if so, is it one of the other competitors for president, or is it somebody entirely different? And do you plan to make an announcement of such leading into the convention, or do you plan to just let the delegates pick somebody for you and go from there?
Sure. First of all, I want to apologize on Jeff's behalf if any of you were offended by his characterization of you all as being, coordinated in an official program. I think he meant it as a compliment. But any group of 6 that includes a shirt that says Libertarian in front of a Montana backdrop, a vest that says Sturgis, and another one that says Taco Treat. This is a renegade bunch. I'll give you that. It's an excellent question, particularly because it has the potential for teasing out insightful information, which I am steadfastly, absolutely not going to share with you. Do I have anyone in mind? Absolutely. Am I going to say anything about that? Absolutely not. I am reminded by what the great conspiracy leader Alan Greenspan once said about monetary policy at the Fed. If I have said anything that allows you to discern what our future policy is going to be, I have misspoken.
Well, so I guess the one thing then I would ask again, as even without knowing what you won't tell me, is about that. Do you plan to make some sort of announcement before the convention about that, or is that going to be the October surprise or the May surprise or whatever?
The party has a history. I don't know if it's actually in its bylaws, but by usual practice, the party has a history of inviting the presidential nominee to remark in a formal sense on his or her recommendation for vice president just before the vice presidential nomination process begins. In other words, in that hour-long period between the time one is completed and the other one begins, the newly nominated presidential candidate is invited to speak to this issue. And out of respect for the process, I will participate in that. But I don't necessarily anticipate trying to sway the body toward a particular individual. There are characteristics of individuals that I believe are very important, not merely to dovetail with our campaign, although that can be important too, right? It has to be someone who obviously is comfortable with a very principles forward platform. It has to be someone who's comfortable with the idea of working very hard at protecting our credibility, someone who's very comfortable leaning into public policy in a deep sense, and yet at the same time, someone who is able to cleave a hard edge against Republicans and Democrats and not say something dopey like, you know, we're fiscally conservative like Republicans and socially liberal like Democrats. That's all important. But it's also important for reasons of success, not just dovetailing with the campaign, but accomplishing what our objectives are. And so, you know, that needs to be said. I do anticipate there being plenty of candidates that would be able to fulfill on those desired characteristics. And for that reason, I think it's important that I personally stay out of it until that time. I don't anticipate there being someone that we need to worry about, you know, an outsider, for example. I mean, that could happen, right?
So you can assure us that you don't have Bill Weld on speed dial then?
For example, if Bill were to, Dave is giving us a quizzical look. I like that. If Bill were to announce, walk on the floor of the open convention in Washington and say, I want to be VP, I think even I would be obliged to say that that's not going to work out, right? You know, I don't believe in running down individuals, but I think that might be an exception to the rule.
And you're not going to commit to a woman of color.
I can commit to it being either a man or a woman, and they will be of some color.
We're not going to end up with another Kamala.
That's true. Okay, that's two individuals against whom I would have to make at least a negative passing remark.
Well, I was curious about it because of that kind of wheeling and dealing, you know, because of the way, again, that the process goes, where we start eliminating candidates, you know, on each ballot, whether or not there would be any sort of, you know, reaching out to a candidate who was dropped off with, you know, hey, can I get your delegates if you're the running mate or something like that? Yeah.
Yeah. There's no question that happens, and we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. And I have absolutely no doubt that we will. As a practical matter, I anticipate that we will draw a large proportion, very likely north of 50%, both from within, for example, the Mises caucus, and north of 50% from the pool of libertarian delegates that are not in the Mises caucus. Just as an example of how to look at the party as a whole. And so it's not my expectation that we'll have to be cutting a deal. But weird things happen. If we have learned anything from American politics in the last dozen years, it is that weird things happen.
Well, I hope you're right. It would be, of course, a little bit less suspenseful, you know, if that happened. But you know, if it was like a first ballot or win or something, but it would be.
I don't think it'll be I don't think it will be a first ballot win. Yeah. I actually expect it'll be third ballot. But
all right, well, I'm going to go place my Vegas bet based on that.
I don't know if Vegas cares enough. Yeah. I do think it'll be a third ballot affair, And let's just say, how do I say this with some political correctness? To the extent to which a deal has to be arranged, you, Jeff, will damn well know it.
Okay. Well, I guess that leads me to the inevitable final question in this thread then, which is, if you are not the presidential nominee, would you accept the vice presidential nomination to run with somebody else?
Unlike, I guess not impossible. I think that that's unlikely, but not impossible. If I thought that, you know, I could dovetail with one of the other candidates and that would make sense. Not impossible. We don't have any candidates that are so horrible that it would be a repugnant consideration.
So even if it was Toad.
I think that, like I said, that strikes me as really unlikely. At that point, you might have a moral obligation. How do you say no?
If RFK Jr. asked you to be his running mate.
No, I'd have to say no to that.
All right.
That would have to be a no. Yeah.
He's already backed out on that anyway.
Good.
As of
I understand.
Like noon today, I think I was filming like 3 videos for people this afternoon, but I think I went back and saw the news and that he had backed out of the whole libertarian thing, which I was grateful for. But
Dave Smith broke him, huh?
Yeah.
I just want to go back to something, and because this was brought up, and the libertarian message about all these different wars going on, at the minimum, is imagine if all of that money was being spent inside of our country. Like, forget the fact that it's being taxed, forget the libertarian messaging. We need a candidate who can say, imagine what the hell could happen if all of these billions of dollars were being spent inside of our country instead of being sent outside of our country. And that was my whole comment about it. I didn't want to extend this, but that was it. So yeah.
No, I mean, it's huge. Even if all you did was say, imagine if every single individual in the United States got a 4% raise.
Yeah, I like that same idea, that same principle that you talked about with the imagine the perfect vaccine, and then you follow that logical train of thought. It seems like on a lot of issues, you can do that same thing and say, like, here's your extreme example of if perfection were possible here, what the principle would be, and then you go from there and apply it to reality. So that, what you just talked about is another example of that.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point. It's well said. Well, thanks, guys. You have been terrific.
Hey, thanks.
Thank you. And I will close it out here. I'll ask you one last question. Do you mind if I put this up on YouTube when you're done?
No, of course not. I'm sure you'll get millions and millions and millions of hits. You may have to give YouTube a heads up that they need to dedicate some more server resource to this, because it's going to explode.
Okay, I'll cut the recording.